Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, in this segment, we are honored and delighted to bring back to the show award-winning historian and author, Professor Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of the award-winning Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, co-author, of course, with Oliver Stone of The Untold History of the United States, New York Times bestseller. Second edition added a couple hundred pages just on the Obama years. Of course, it's also an amazing documentary series. Project Censored audience, folks, Peter Kuznick is no stranger to you all. It's been far too long since we've had him on the program, and there is so much happening around the world. We all can use the wisdom and wit and even humor in dark times of Professor Peter Kuznick. Peter Kuznick, welcome back to the Project Censored Show today.
Hi, Mickey. It's great to be back with you. I wish we were talking under happier circumstances.
Absolutely. And, you know, I sort of wanted to get that out of the way in the beginning, that there's so many things happening that are very, very serious. And as an historian, as well as a commentator on contemporary events, you fused past and present so masterfully, better than most people that I know. Can you talk to us a little bit about, what's been going on with Israel and Gaza since last October has really eclipsed in many ways a lot of other things that have been happening in the world, whether it's other parts of the Middle East or the Congo, or of course, Russia and Ukraine, right? And there's so many things that are developing, and of course with Russia and China. Could you please catch us up on the many things that are happening lately, particularly around Russia, Ukraine, and things that are happening in Southeast Asia? Peter Kuznick.
Well, you know that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock, I think it was last year, to 90 seconds before midnight. The reality is we're much closer than that. 90 seconds was a relatively good period compared to where we've gone in the last few months. Jeff Sachs had a very interesting piece about some of this, just came out yesterday, in which he tracked how close to midnight the doomsday clock has gotten in the last 5 presidencies. So beginning with Clinton, because it was like something like 17 minutes to midnight when the Soviet Union collapsed. And now we've gotten progressively from Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. We're now down to 90 seconds technically, but the reality is if I were on that board of advisors and I had to say how close we are now, I would certainly move it to 60 seconds before midnight. And we've almost got to inch it a little bit forward by the day. The news that just came out yesterday that Biden has now authorized Ukraine to use US weapons to hit inside of Russia. This just happened. Germany, Scholz, just issued a new doctrine which says that German weapons can also be used to hit inside of Russia. Now, both of them are using the caveat not to strike deep within Russia, but to strike over the border where the Russians are targeting Kharkiv, right? Kharkiv is 19 miles from the Russian border. So Russia's got a lot of weaponry on the Russian side that is targeting Kharkiv. So that is now a fair game for the Ukrainians. But, you put this in the context of the broader escalation that's gone on in recent weeks. We can begin it with the failed counter-offensive on the part of Ukraine, which took place in the spring and summer. So the Russians resisted that. The Russians have corrected many of their erroneous military doctrines, and they've also now got a new Secretary of Defense in place instead of Shoigu. And things there, especially when Prigozhin attempted that coup, the situation in Russia looked very, very shaky. But since that point, they've actually stabilized things. Putin's regained much more control, and the Russian military has learned from a lot of their mistakes. So not only did the Ukrainian counteroffensive fail, but Russia has gone on the offensive. And they've been able to do that effectively for a number of reasons. One, they learned a lot of lessons, but two, Ukraine's manpower deficit is overwhelming. I mean, Russia's got such an advantage in terms of manpower, and many young Ukrainians have either fled the country or doing whatever they can to dodge the draft. So even though Zelensky has lowered the draft age from 27 to 25, there's tremendous opposition to even doing that inside Ukraine. Morale has been terrible. So on the numbers game, they're losing and badly. But worse than that, with the U.S. delaying its arms package and its financial aid package, the 61 billion that they finally authorized, uh, Ukraine faced an extraordinary 10-to-1 to 20-to-1 deficit, depending on whose figures you believe, in artillery and ammunition. And so put those together, and Ukraine is not only losing ground in the south and the east, but then Russia opened the offensive in the northeast in Kharkiv. And it took a lot, they've taken a lot more ground, hundreds of square miles of territory that they've been able to conquer. And the situation is only growing more and more desperate. So to counter that desperation, many of the NATO members, and including the United States, have been calling for more extreme measures. Now, initially, that took the form of more and more advanced weapon systems. And we saw that dance play out over and over again, where first Biden would resist every new weapon system, and then he would finally cave in. You can imagine what those debates would sound like. Uh, Victoria Nuland would be the leading cheerleader for the new weapon systems. But it was an interesting development, just as an aside. After Wendy Sherman retired as the number 2 in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, who's the extreme Russia hawk, who was helped engineer, or at least cheerlead the coup,
Yes.
the Maidan uprising, Victoria Nuland was passed over. She was the acting number 2 for months, and from her vantage point, pushing a more aggressive policy toward Russia and Ukraine. She was passed over for Kurt Campbell. Kurt Campbell, as you know, Mickey, is the leading China hawk, and which really signaled the Biden administration's priorities. Because Biden came to power with 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. And those are the people who are the real China hawks. And that was the attitude always, that China's the pacing threat. Russia's an annoyance and they're a nuclear threat, but they not really a competitor to the United States. So Nuland was passed over, but she's been speaking out anyway. And among the things she's been urging is allowing Ukraine to use U.S. weapons in order to attack inside of Russia. Putin has been issuing warnings about this,
Yes.
saying that not only will Russia retaliate against sites in Ukraine, including the European and other weapon sites in Ukraine, but they'll also hit outside of Ukraine as well. So Putin is effectively, so let me backtrack a little more.
Yeah.
So a lot of this begins with Macron urging sending NATO troops into Ukraine in 2 capacities. One is as trainers, or 3 capacities really. One is as trainers. Secondly, is to run the advanced weapon systems that the Ukrainians themselves can't run and provide the targeting information. And thirdly, is ground troops. So they know that Ukraine is losing, that the Ukraine is threatened with an actual military collapse and a defeat. And so you look at the logic that's being played out steadily. And we saw that from Mike Johnson. When Mike Johnson flipped from opposing U.S. weapons to Ukraine
Right.
to, fast tracking them finally. Uh, what Mike Johnson said is that we don't want to see Russia, you know, take over all these other European countries. That's the lie that's at the heart of it that you and I understand as historians, because we trace that this idea that this boogeyman image that was always created of the Soviet Union. When Ronald Reagan would say how far behind the Soviets we are militarily, why we've got to have a 50% increase in military spending. We see this over and over again. We saw it with the Gaither report after Sputnik. We saw it with the missile gas, all that
Yeah,
missile
yeah.
gas insanity. We see it repeatedly with the domino theory.
Yes.
We saw it. I mean, we can look at it over and over again. This idea that Russia is out to conquer the world. NHTSA was using that line to support NSC 68 back in 1950,
Yeah.
which called for a quadrupling of U.S. military spending. The Project for a New American Century, the neocons, that was what they were all about. The need for vastly increasing our military because we're so weak. And we're seeing that now play out in the Pacific, and we're seeing it play out in the Middle East, and we're seeing it play out with the Russians. And so when Mike Johnson explained his flip-flop, he said, well, I've seen these intelligence reports that show how powerful Russia is and how bent they are on world conquest. And if we don't stop them in Ukraine, they're going to take over Poland. They're going
Geez,
to take over the Baltics.
are we in a time machine, Peter Kuznick?
Well, we're in an infinite negative loop right now, and it is so frightening. The other historical parallel is when Fico, the prime minister in Slovakia, there was that assassination attempt on him,
Yes.
felt like a pre-World War I
One.
moment. It
Yes.
felt like Sarajevo. The you got all these entangling alliances and assassinations. And you look at the response to Trump's conviction yesterday. Reuters had a very interesting article where they monitored all of the pro-Trump sites. And on one after the other, they're all calling for an armed uprising and assassinating judges and witnesses and legislators. I mean, we are in many ways both a pre-World War I and pre-World War II moment, where you've got fascist forces on the rise around the world, including in the United States, and the limited democracy that allows us to have this conversation. You and I both are critics of the American system and all the disparities and the surveillance state that's been created in the national security state and the military state. But we do have certain freedoms that we have to defend, including the ability for us to criticize our own government, which is very, very important and is something that my friends in Russia don't have right now, and my friends in China don't have right now. And we still do have that. We have to recognize how important that is because we like to criticize everything, but it's not, but we have to have a more nuanced view of what is good and what is redeemable and salvageable and what we have to change.
Well, indeed. And Peter Kuznick, we're going to be coming up on a break in a moment, but the aid package that you were talking about specifically was giving money to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, correct?
Yeah.
So there's another issue with that we've actually been writing about, because as a writer on that package was the TikTok ban or divestment, right? Because it's owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. And actually, Mitt Romney and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said out loud that the reasons that they were targeting it was basically because they couldn't control it and that there was information on it that they didn't exactly like, particularly around news coming from Gaza.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so I found it very troubling and you mentioned Mike Johnson, but that package is going to further more war issues. The United States is again arming, more countries around the world, while simultaneously trying to shut down any kind of information that counters their hegemonic propaganda, which is to me very problematic. I have no illusions about what social media companies do as far as being data harvesters, or how they censor or deplatform, or algorithmically work toward people's confirmation biases, all real issues. But all of them have those issues, not just TikTok, right?
Exactly.
All of them do. And so
It-
the targeting of it is so overtly political that this is why, and this is what sparked this, that we got to take a break in a second, and then we'll come back. But when you were talking about the freedoms that we have to talk about these things, right? That's very important, but we can only meaningfully and intelligently talk about them if we have access to accurate, transparently sourced information. And when information is, blockaded the degree to which that we have to rely on social media platforms to get information about things that are happening in certain parts of the world, that's a pretty damning indictment of the failures of the fourth estate in the larger picture. That all of our information systems are wrought with many problems and challenges. Peter Kuznick.
I mean, I totally agree with you about TikTok. You know, if they want to control the social media, I mean, they can control them all, you
Yeah,
know, because they all are a problem. They all
yeah,
participate in the dumbing down of American society,
absolutely.
which is really a problem.
Yeah,
Um,
it
you know,
is.
and
I,
especially when it comes to understanding history,
Yeah,
as you
indeed. So there's so much to catch up on with you, and you just caught us up a little bit on how serious internationally our situation has become, particularly regarding Russia. And of course, you've been mentioning China. There's a lot more to discuss, and we haven't even got into Israel, Gaza yet. So, Peter Kuznick, do you want to maybe segue into the talk about from Russia over to what's happening with China, or do you want to shift our attention to the Middle East? It's either way, we have too many things to discuss.
Yeah. Well, let me just comment on what we were saying right
Yep,
before that.
please, please.
You know, I take the mainstream media to task all the time,
Indeed.
but the situation has gotten so dangerous now that even the Washington Post has been running articles about how the threat of nuclear war increasing with the authorization to strike targets inside of
Inside.
Russia. Reuters, has been full of articles the last few days talking about how dire the situation has become. Uh,
But the noise of the Trump trial just drowns all that out, doesn't it?
well, yeah, anything that you're not going to see much of it on CNN or
No,
MSNBC or Fox or,
no,
uh,
no.
so we've got to use all of our sources because you look what's coming. You and I try to read as much of the Russian and Chinese and European and Latin American press as possible. And there are a lot of developments that go unreported in mainstream sources here. The fact that there's a lot of pushback inside NATO to
Hmm.
this targeting, that Italy, that Spain, that
So there's division here. So
Hungary,
talk a little about
Orban,
that. Yeah, talk
we
about that
we
division.
like to dismiss Orban as a proto-fascist, but he talks so much sense. I mean, he talks about these other NATO leaders as being crazy. He says the things that they want to do in terms of provoking Russia are going to lead to World War III, and he says this very openly. So we have the assassination attempt on Fico in Slovakia, who's also condemning the NATO aggression. So there are people out there. We've got the meetings between Xi Jinping and Lula, and they're issuing this 6-point peace plan for Ukraine. That doesn't get discussed in the Western media, but when I look at China's previous 12-point plan, and what I like about it is the first point defends sovereignty.
Mm.
It talks about the importance of national sovereignty, implicitly criticizing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the second point says no nation's security should be achieved at the expense of other nations' security, which is their attack on NATO expansion up to Russia's doorstep. And China has tried to play that role. What I've been doing with some of my colleagues is trying to get to Guterres. You look now for who speaks for the planet. And there is almost nobody who speaks. Biden wants to make America great again, and Putin wants to make Russia great again, and she wants to make China great again, and Modi wants to make India great again. And Netanyahu, who knows he wants to do other than stay out of jail and kill Palestinians. But but who speaks for the planet? You've got Guterres, who's been very good. You've got the Pope on occasion. You've got Lula, sometimes Xi Jinping. But what we've been trying to do is light a fire under Guterres to call for a global summit. We need to step back from the brink over China, Taiwan, the South China Seas, Israel and Gaza, as well as over Ukraine. Ukraine is the most immediately urgent crisis that we've faced in more than 60 years. But any one of these could explode into World War III. You mentioned Israel and Gaza. Well, I've been doing a lot of interviews about that as well, of course. And and I always go out of my way to say that I'm not a supporter of Hamas. I don't like Hamas. I don't like religious zealotry in any form. I don't like their attitude toward Israel as a state. I hate what they did on October 7th, and I condemn it every chance I get. But there's no possible excuse for what Israel is doing. Being someone who lost most of my family before I was born in the Holocaust, I'm very careful about using the term genocide. So I'm not sure if this is a genocide, but it sure gets too close to a genocide for anybody's liking. And this idea that Israel has to wipe out Hamas. What gets lost in this to me is that Hamas was never considered a threat. Hamas would launch a few rockets, sometimes kill a few people in Israel each year, and that was a bad thing. But they never posed a threat, which is why Netanyahu supported them, why he authorized Qatar to keep on funding them, as well as Iran, why he wanted to maintain them there, because as long as Hamas had control in Gaza, then they would never get together with the Palestinian Authority and form a two-state solution. But when it came to the attack on October 7th, Israel had the plans for more than a year. Israel knew the whole plan for that attack. They saw them training the weekend before the attack occurred. They didn't care about it. And Netanyahu had moved the Israeli troops from the Gaza border up to support the fascists in the West Bank, those settlers who were trying to take more and more Palestinian land and attacking the Palestinians and killing the Palestinians. And so, yeah, and then the Israeli army took 2 days to respond. I mean, and Israeli intelligence, I mean, what is going on there? He had divided the country with his so-called judicial reform and had divided the Israelis before that. This whole idea that Hamas represents some kind of existential threat for Israel is totally bogus, along the same lines that we're talking about with Ukraine, that Russia represents an existential threat to Europe.
We heard this 20 some years ago after 9/11, Peter Kuznick, and that was the neocons prior to that and rebuilding America's defenses that were talking about the westward expansion and Pax Americana and the whole plan for the 21st century American hegemony and so forth. I mean, and then after 9/11, it was all Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and ISIS and all that. And even though that, it turned out that Bill Clinton had been working with those folks earlier, turns out that we were working with different factions of ISIS and other groups thereafter. I mean, if you take a look at that history, which is pretty remarkable, but that's that history that's either, well, untold history, which you're certainly expert at, and it also doesn't seem to really break through the noise of the culture into the dominant news culture, the establishment press, the legacy press. There's a lot of details that Americans just simply don't know anything about. And just spinning back to Israel for a moment, we're up to 37,000 dead.
No. My sources say well over 50,000.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm
These
using
are
a
only the
low
ones
number.
that the Gaza Health Ministry
Yes.
can confirm. But
Right.
there are so
Right.
many people buried under that rubble. And it's so
Exactly.
heartbreaking to see those
Yeah.
images of infants and children being pulled out from that rubble.
Which many people aren't seeing here, Peter Kuznick, right? And again,
But
back to the TikTok ban.
the place they're really not seeing it is in Israel.
Yeah, right. No, I was just going to say that. Go ahead, please continue.
Yeah, the censorship on the
It
media
is
in Israel
extraordinary. Banning
is,
Al Jazeera, taking the AP equipment and then giving it back, but taking it. They're trying to shut down the whole show, Peter Kuznick.
no, that's totally right. And
Ditto in Russia with the censorship in Russia. There is a lot of press censorship there too.
I know, and I hate seeing it. I
Right.
mean, I hate that my friend, I mean, I would go there. I got invited on a regular basis before Trump's election in 2016. And as you know, all my Russian friends were supporting Trump and saying that he's going to be a friend to Russia. And talks about peace with Russia. And I kept saying, uh, as much as I dislike Hillary Clinton, the world is going to be much better off with a sane hawk, a warmonger like Hillary Clinton, than with an insane warmonger like Donald Trump.
Yeah,
You know,
quite a predicament we have here, Peter Kuznick.
and at least if and Biden is in many ways worse than Clinton was, although they're both cut out of that same cloth. But if Biden gets elected, and I keep on urging all my Democrat friends to find an alternative to Biden, but Biden is so selfish, so narcissistic that he's willing to risk being defeated by Trump and putting this outright fascist in power who will never leave office. If Trump gets in there again, he's never going to leave, at least not maybe in a box,
Yeah.
but
Well, Peter Kuznick, let's so as an historian, again, we don't we're not supposed to be prognosticators, but you have not only do you have this vast historical knowledge, you put it to use. You talk to many people around the world. You're trying to facilitate some types of solutions and ceasefires and some kind of peaceful process. Can you talk to us about where, and given that the American public is largely in the dark about many of these things, can you talk a little bit more in detail about some of the efforts that you see or that you would prescribe if you don't see them as a way of mitigating these multiple crises around the world? And the U.S. seems to be embroiled in either in the middle of or on the right on the sidelines of all of them. Peter Kuznick.
the U.S. really is at minimally enabling all of them. In most cases, the U.S. is arming all of them.
Yes.
The U.S. is funding all of them. China talks about win-win diplomacy. They don't always practice it. In terms of I think that they could be show much more largesse toward the other countries in the South China Sea. Vietnam and Brunei and, Philippines and all the others that they've got these disputes with. But you have to realize that those countries also have expansive claims to the South China Sea. It's not just China that's got these expansive claims. And in many cases, China's claims go back thousands of years, whereas the Philippines' claims to the Second Thomas Shoal might go back to the 1950s. So it's a very complicated history, but we need to sit down. And there was just a meeting in Beijing this week with China and the Arab states. And Sisi is making an official visit there now. But China is reaching out, trying to push for a peaceful resolution in the Middle East as well. I mean, in all of these situations, what we need is diplomacy. The world has lost track of diplomacy, and that's largely the U.S. doing. Putin keeps saying he's open to negotiating on Ukraine. And I keep saying, and I do have access to the media all over the world, but not in the
Not
United States.
here.
Right. But not in my own country, except, with you, of course, and progressive sources, but not mainstream sources, or very rarely. But I did close to 300 TV interviews last year around the world. And, and my message is almost always, we need to sit down and talk. Call Putin's bluff. He says he wants to negotiate over Ukraine. And there are reasons why I think he really does want to. He's not going to give up a lot of territory, right? He's going to draw, he says he's going to draw the line where it is now militarily, and they'll take that. Uh, One of my favorite Japanese movies in 1991, that won the Academy Awards in Japan, movie about Hiroshima called Black Rain. That same
Yeah.
year, Kurosawa's Rhapsody in August about Nagasaki came out, and Black Rain. And in Black Rain, you got the atomic bomb survivors, and then they're getting reports that that this is the Korean War now. It's 5 years later, and we're talking about using nuclear weapons again in Korea. And one of the survivors says to another, he says, an unjust peace is better than a just war. And that's my view when we come to what's going on now in Ukraine. It's an unjust peace. Russian aggression should not be rewarded, but unjust peace is better than a just war there. And from a Ukrainian standpoint, if this goes on another year, as Biden would like to see, they all say that 2025 could be Ukraine's year. Ukraine is never going to push the Russians out of Ukraine, out of that territory, like Zelensky demands. Uh, what we're going to have is a year from now, 200,000 more Ukrainians dead and wounded, more of the Ukrainian economy destroyed, more land lost. What is the point? And the possibility of World War III, grows by the day. Why don't we have leaders who are willing to sit down and attempt diplomacy? The US and Russia, our strategic stability talks don't exist anymore.
Well, it's as if
Our
talking is
nuclear
like traitor. People equate talking and diplomacy almost with treason. I mean, it's a pretty
Yes.
radical, extreme environment we're in right now, Peter Kuznick.
And people who talk about diplomacy are dismissed as dupes, as
Naive. Yeah.
Putin stooges.
Yes,
You
that's a
know,
good one.
the is so it's and when you watch it as an historian and you see us inexorably moving toward the abyss and with nobody stopping it, which is why I think we desperately need a global summit, and we need to get Biden, and we'll let Sunak come, and Modi and Xi, and Putin, and we've got to figure out how to tamp down all of these hotspots, because any one of them could lead to a war, or
Peter,
broader war, World War
Peter,
III.
absolutely, Peter Kuznick. I wanted to just get it quickly, if you could. There, just the use, the failure of diplomacy. We can go back to the League of Nations, World War I, World War II, right? UN. The UN seems to struggle with the Security Council stalemates, and each side saying that it's a useless body, or it's a tool of whatever, either the US or NATO or others. But what about the International Criminal Court? That's also now being very, very politicized. On one level, we saw the Biden administration lauding the ICC when they were talking about Putin and war crimes. But now when we see Netanyahu and Hamas, now they're saying, well, the ICC doesn't matter. It's well, the favorite word of the last several years in this country has been rigged. Right, everything's rigged, from the NFL to elections. Peter Kuznick, can you talk a little bit about that and sort of the challenge that presents?
Well, I would talk about the rigging of Major League Baseball before
Yeah,
I
there
went
you go.
to the NFL, because at least
Okay.
the NFL has a salary cap. You
Okay.
know, when you got the Dodgers and the Yankees spending billions of dollars on buying up players, that's
Yeah,
a little bit more rigged. But I'm glad the Orioles are going to beat the Yankees anyway, um, despite that fact they have just about the lowest
that's right.
salary. But when we come to or the U.S. response to the UN Security Council statement on Gaza, and the U.S. says it's non-binding. How is that non-binding? I mean, that's the law. That's non-binding, but the U.S. rules-based international order is
Yeah,
somehow legitimate.
yeah,
I mean, we've lost all reason at this point. We've lost any respect for other countries' red lines. We've lost respect for global rationality, and we've lost respect for diplomacy. And some of us, you and me and Jeff Sachs and Yvonne, Ivana Hughes and some of our allies, um, Ray McGovern and other people who we work with and look up to, and are pushing for diplomacy because
And you're
people who
great.
understand how
You're
close we are to nuclear Armageddon, are not the ones who are in power in the Biden administration.
Peter Kuznick, your late great friend Daniel Ellsberg, to the end, was fighting for this, against nuclear annihilation, fighting for world peace. Such a towering figure.
Dan was a voice in the wilderness. I mean, Dan understood. He was in touch with Roebuck and Toon and the physicists and the astrophysicists who were working on nuclear winter. And Dan learned this back in his days at Harvard and in his war games that he was doing, and as the leading expert on command and control of nuclear weapons in the Defense Department in the early 60s, and
Rand Corporation. Yeah.
his work with Rand. I mean, Dan understood how crazy a situation we're in. That there is, as Jonathan Schell, another dear friend who I miss terribly, as Jonathan Schell made clear, no specific issue and gains that can come from any specific issue are worth threatening the world with annihilation. And Kennedy made that same point in his AU commencement address.
He
He
did.
said to put a nuclear armed power in a position of either suffering a humiliating defeat or resorting to nuclear weapons is either a colossal failure of statesmanship or a death wish on the part of the human race. And that's what we see. We see the NATO countries trying to put Russia in that position where Russia and Putin is responding with his own saber rattling and threats. Russia just conducted the first ever tactical nuclear weapons drill that was on the border of Ukraine. They are signaling as clearly as they can, back off, because we are going to respond in a way that is going to be horrific. And Biden has said that there is almost no chance of a limited nuclear war, that once it starts, it spreads to Armageddon and mass annihilation on our planet. But we're sleepwalking, and we're not seeing this. You look, just a report came out from the London-based International Strategic Studies Institute, I think it's called, about war games in the Pacific. And they traced it from 2001, I think, to 2022 or 2023. And they said that the number of war games, military exercises in the Pacific has been increasing at a very, very rapid rate. I think I've got the statistics here. Between 2003 and 2022, the London-based International Institute of Strategic Studies said that the U.S. and its allies in Asia ran 1,113 military exercises. China ran 130 with its allies. So China is far behind, but increasing. And China is increasing its military capabilities. China has, in terms of the number of ships, the biggest surface fleet in the world now, not in terms of the tonnage, which the U.S. is still far ahead. China, which used to rely on a nuclear deterrent of 200 nuclear weapons, is now past 500. The Pentagon says that they want to have 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. So China is also, they say, we want to have a credible second strike, as credible deterrent.
Back to detente.
The world is just moving, and as I was saying before, every nuclear arms treaty has been abrogated. There's nothing left. The New START treaty, which was all we had, now is not being abided by anymore. And so the United States, we just had this military posture commission, bipartisan congressional commission, called for dramatically increasing America's nuclear arsenal. So all those years we saw the decreasing nuclear arsenals down to the point we've got under 13,000 weapons now, nuclear weapons. But now the United States is talking about increasing it. The British are talking about increasing theirs by 40%. China by far more than that. Russia is talking about increasing it again. India, I mean, every single nuclear power is not only modernizing, they're increasing their arsenal. And we've got other countries, you look at the situation with Iran. Under the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, they were at least a year away from a breakout of developing a nuclear weapon. Now the experts say they might be a month away. Under before Trump abrogated the nuclear deal with Iran, Iran had shipped out 97% of its highly enriched uranium. Iran was enriching only up to what little bit more than 3%. Now Iran is enriching up to more than 60%. The jump from 60% to 90%, which is a nuclear weapon, is easy. The hard part is to get from 3% to 60%. All those mothballed centrifuges, which they had done, now are all operating again. And we've got an upcoming election in Iran. We had the
Oh, yeah.
assassination, or not the assassination, but
The
the death,
helicopter crash.
yeah, the
Yeah.
helicopter attack, which fortunately they have not tried to blame on Israel because that could have triggered
Well, Israel already they are already attacking. I mean, again, the US and others attacking right over, talking about it's okay to attack over the Russian border. Israel's already attacked Iranian, they've already killed people.
well,
They've
they
killed the
were trying.
general. They attacked the embassy. I mean,
Well,
again,
that was they attacked the consulate in
yeah,
Damascus, the
yeah,
Iranian consulate, and Iran had a symbolic
killing people.
feeble response.
Yeah,
But Iran's has so many ways, as we know.
yeah,
You look at their proxies.
yes,
Hamas is weak, but if you look at Hezbollah, they've got 150,000 missiles and rockets and drones that could overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome defense system. You've got the Houthis increasing their attacks now. You've got Hamas. You've got the militias in Syria and Iraq. I mean,
yeah,
there's so many capabilities aside from Iran itself carrying out this attack. We're going to have now new elections in Iran, and it's going to be one hardliner or another.
yeah.
Is going
It's not good. And Peter Kuznick, history seems to suggest that we don't learn much from history.
to, sadly, we learn very little from history. I was just looking at a Reinhold Niebuhr
Yes.
quote from 1951, from, I guess, Ironies of History. And he talks about uh, how countries, how, how evil gets promulgated by countries who think that they have righteousness on their side. And whether it's, look at Biden. Uh, this is not an evil man, but he's a feeble old fool who surrounds himself with hawkish advisors and can't stand up to them,
Howard, Newland,
and
Blinken.
collapses in every confrontation. Uh, that's why we love Kennedy, not everything he did, but the fact that he alone would stand up to not only all of his political advisors, but all of his military advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that he'd be willing to resist all of their pressure to bomb and invade Cuba. And we know now that would have triggered World War III.
And he
Had
stood up to Dulles, and he stood up to the CIA, and
and
well,
Eisenhower, yeah,
we saw how that ended for JFK.
right. And Biden clearly, if he ever had that backbone, which I've never seen, or that inclination, he certainly doesn't have it now.
So, Peter Kuznick, I want to thank you for all the important work you do as an historian, as a public intellectual, really trying to help people understand the things that are going on around the world. As ever, it's very enlightening. And even though we seem to be in pretty dark times, you have some pretty specific reminders that diplomacy, talking, understanding, empathy, these are things that we have to embrace, or else we won't have anything left to embrace.
You know, and you don't negotiate with your friends and allies. You negotiate with your adversaries. And part of the problem is we so demonize Putin. You know, once you start using the Hitler analogies or the other things that Biden has said or Zelensky has said about Putin, that almost of necessity rules out talking.
Mhm.
You know,
Poisons the well.
once you, you know, you, this demonization that goes on, this impugning somebody else's integrity and their motives. You know, I don't like the invasion of Ukraine, but I understand the ways in which it was provoked. And I understand that it was a failure on everybody's part. And Putin really did want that Minsk II agreement to work. And Scholz and Merkel played him for a fool, you know, and they dragged it out so that Ukraine would have time to rearm. You know, we know how that went. You know, there's blame to go around. And that's why I don't think there are any good guys really, or very, very few good guys in the world. And I think we've got to sit down and negotiate agreements that are in everybody's
Mm,
interest. The way agreements work and are adhered to is they are in everybody's interest, what the Chinese call win-win.
mm.
And we can do that over Ukraine, and we could do that over with a two-state solution, and we can do that over Taiwan and the South China Sea. We just need to inject some humanity, some decency, some rationality, some diplomacy into this picture.
Well, Peter Kuznick, once again, thank you so much for joining us on the Project Censored Show, co-author with Oliver Stone of The Untold History of the United States, professor of history at American University. And I know we were saying there seems to be a paucity of good guys, but in my book, you're one of the good guys, Peter Kuznick. So keep up the
Thank you, Vicky.
keep up the stellar work that you're doing. Much appreciated.
You too. Thank you.